The air inside Aethelgard Station did not circulate. It pulsed. It was a rhythmic, antiseptic breath that tasted of ozone and expensive filtration. Kaelen Vance adjusted the strap of his weathered canvas rucksack, feeling the heavy, familiar weight of his survival kit thumping against his lower back. It was an archaic piece of gear in a place made of shimmering hard light and sentient glass, but Kaelen didn't give a damn. On Earth, fancy usually meant easily broken. He stepped through the pressure seal of the grand atrium, and for a moment, the sheer scale of the Hexad sovereignty's architecture threatened to overwhelm him. The ceiling was a transparent dome peering into the violet swirl of a micro-black hole held in check by massive stasis pylons. Floating platforms drifted in silence, carrying students of a dozen different biologies toward their lecture halls. As Kaelen walked, the silence followed him. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was a vacuum created by fear. To his left, a group of Voltari, beings of living purple quartz, stiffened. Their crystalline facets dimmed, a biological sign of extreme distress. They didn't just see a student. They saw a predator from a Class 12 Deathworld. They saw a monster that breathed an atmosphere of nitrogen and oxygen, a creature whose bones were reinforced with calcium to withstand a crushing gravity they could barely fathom. "Look at that gate," a voice whispered, translated through Kaelen's ear cuff. It was a watery, gurgling sound. "He walks as if he wants to break the floor." Kaelen didn't slow down. He knew his Deathworlder swagger was just the result of growing up in 1.0 gravity, whereas most of the sovereignty elite hailed from Class 1 or 2 floaters, with gravity so light a human could jump over a building. "Easy, Vance," he muttered to himself, his voice a low rasp. "Just a student. Just here for the credits. Don't spook the locals." He reached the orientation hall and found it packed. Hundreds of floating seats were arranged in perfect, concentric circles. He spotted an empty spot near the front, the best view of the lecturer. As he approached, a luminette, a creature that looked like a sentient nebula contained within a translucent suit, flickered violently from gold to an angry, frightened red. It quickly maneuvered its seat 5 rows back. Kaelen sighed and sat down. The seat adjusted to his weight, with a protesting groan of hydraulics. He pulled out his ruggedized data pad, its screen scratched from years of field use in the radioactive ruins of the Siberian wastes. Around him, the other students were using neural links or delicate light arrays. They looked like porcelain dolls, and he felt like a sledgehammer in a jewelry shop. A hush fell as a figure materialized on the central dais. It wasn't a solid being, but a shifting cloud of iridescent gas held in a containment field. This was Professor Silas, the sovereignty's foremost expert on hostile environments. "Welcome, initiates," Silas's voice echoed through their neural links, bypassing the air entirely. It was a cold, logical tone. "You have enrolled in extreme survival practicum. Look at the person to your left. Now look to your right. Statistics suggest that by the end of the first week, 40% of you will have triggered your emergency beacons. By the final simulation, only 10% will remain." A collective ripple of anxiety washed through the room. A small, furred student in the second row began to hyperventilate, his whiskers twitching. "Survival is not an academic pursuit," Silas continued. "It is the art of not dying when the universe tries to kill you. We start with Assignment 0, immediate assessment. No prep time, no suits." Silas gestured, and the floor in the center of the hall opened. A large, transparent tank rose. Inside was something Kaelen hadn't seen in 3 years. It was a pile of dry wood, real, organic timber. "The assignment is simple. Silas said. Each group will send one representative to interact with this substance. You must create a controlled thermal reaction using only the kinetic tools provided. We call this combustion. It is the most primitive form of energy. Most of you have never seen a naked flame. It is unpredictable. It is hungry. It consumes oxygen. It is a Class 5 hazard. The room went deathly silent. To these aliens, fire wasn't a tool. It was an ancient, mythical terror. "Who will go first?" Silas asked. Kaelen didn't wait. He unbuckled his rucksack. He could feel the eyes on him. Hundreds of sensors, stalks, and multifaceted eyes tracking his every move. "I'll bite," Kaelen said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. He stood up and descended the stairs. He could hear the whispers becoming frantic. "The Deathworlder is moving. He's going toward the hazard. Is he suicidal?" Kaelen stepped into the tank area. On a small pedestal lay 2 pieces of flint and a steel striker. It was a setup designed to be difficult, to test their kinetic coordination. Kaelen looked at the wood. It was pine, dry, good tinder. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of homesickness. He remembered his father teaching him this in the shadow of the Appalachian ruins, with the wind howling and the wolves circling the perimeter. "This isn't a hazard," Kaelen murmured, picking up the flint. "It's a friend." He knelt, his movements fluid and economical. He didn't fumble. He didn't shake. He struck the steel against the flint with a sharp, practiced flick of his wrist. Spark. The students gasped. Several scrambled backward in their floating chairs. Spark. A tiny orange glow caught a shaving of wood. Kaelen leaned in, his face inches from the heat, and breathed. It was a gentle, nurturing breath, the kind you give a flickering hope. The smoke curled up, bitter and sweet. Then, a small, defiant tongue of flame licked the air. Kaelen fed it. Small twigs first, then the larger chunks. Within a minute, a modest campfire was crackling in the center of the hall. The light reflected in his dark eyes, casting long, dancing shadows against the sterile walls of the academy. He stood up, his face bathed in the warm, orange glow. He looked at the professor, then at the terrified students who were staring at the fire as if it were a demon. "Assignment complete," Kaelen said. He didn't mention that back home. This was what they did for fun on a Tuesday night. The aftermath of the fire demonstration was a mixture of awe and absolute terror. For the next 2 hours, the medical drones were busy administering sedatives to 3 students who had fainted from oxygen displacement anxiety. Kaelen sat back in his seat, smelling of wood smoke. It was the best he'd felt since leaving the Earth's gravity well, but the isolation had only deepened. The buffer zone of empty seats around him had grown from 2 rows to 5. Even the professor's containment field seemed to pulse with a wary rhythm. "Impressive, Candidate Vance," Silas said, the iridescent gas of its body swirling faster. "Your species possesses a disturbing familiarity with high-energy oxidation. Tell me, do all humans handle plasma-grade hazards with such lack of concern?" Kaelen leaned back, crossing his heavy boots over one another. "It's just fire, Professor. If you're scared of it, it burns you. If you respect it, it keeps you alive. Basic math." "Survival is rarely basic math in the hexad," Silas countered. "You have survived Assignment 0, but that was a controlled environment. Tomorrow, we move to the biodome. You will be assigned to squads. Coordination is mandatory. No one survives alone." Kaelen felt a weight in his stomach. Squads. That was the catch. He could survive a hurricane with a toothpick and a roll of duct tape, but he couldn't survive the social nightmare of being the only predator in a room full of prey. The bell rang, a harmonic chime that vibrated in the bones. As the students filtered out, Kaelen moved toward the exit, trying to keep his pace slow. He didn't want to trigger anyone's flight instinct by moving too fast. "Vance! Wait!" The voice was thin and had a strange, melodic trill to it. Kaelen stopped and turned. Approaching him was a student he recognized from the front row. It was Zenith, the Oryx. Their body was a shimmering mass of translucent blue liquid held together by a thin, flexible membrane. They didn't walk so much as flow, their internal organs visible as glowing, pulsing nodes of light. "You are the human," Zenith said, their body undulating with nervousness. "I am Zenith. I monitored your heart rate during the thermal reaction. It didn't increase, not even by 3 beats per minute." "How?" Kaelen shrugged. "Practice. You get used to the heat when your planet is trying to bake you half the year." Zenith's blue liquid swirled into a darker shade of indigo. "My planet, Oryxia, is a Class 1 aquatic paradise. The temperature hasn't changed by more than 2 degrees in 10,000 years. The idea of burning is statistically impossible there." Zenith hesitated, their membrane shimmering. "The squads are being formed by the system. I checked the roster. I have been placed with you." Kaelen blinked. "Poor kid. Who'd you piss off?" Zenith tilted their head, or the part of their body that functioned as a head. "I do not understand the colloquialism, but the other students, they are petitioning for transfers. They say you are volatile. They say your presence increases the risk of the simulation by 42%. Kaelen felt a familiar sting of bitterness, but he pushed it down. "And you? You're not running to the dean?" "I am a scientist," Zenith said, their internal nodes glowing brighter. "Statistics say humans are dangerous, but my observations show that you are the only one in this hall who didn't lose their nerve. If the universe tries to kill me, I would rather be standing next to the person who knows how to fight back." Kaelen looked at the liquid being. Zenith was barely holding their form together. The membrane was vibrating with sheer terror. Yet they were standing their ground. "You've got guts, Zenith. Or whatever the equivalent is for your people," Kaelen said, a ghost of a smile appearing on his lips. "All right. We're a squad. But listen up. My way is loud, it's messy, and it's going to break every safety protocol in your handbook. You okay with that?" Zenith's body gave a frantic, watery ripple, the Oryx equivalent of a nod. "I have already backed up my consciousness to the station's cloud. I am prepared for the mess." "Good," Kaelen said, patting his rucksack. "Meet me at the biodome at 0600, and bring a water filter if you've got one. The sovereignty ones are junk." The next morning, the biodome was shrouded in artificial mist. It was a massive enclosure, 5 kilometers across, designed to mimic a Class 5 world. To the aliens, this was a nightmare of unpredictable weather and savage herbivores. To Kaelen, it looked like a rainy day in Oregon. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting vegetation. Kaelen breathed it in deep, ignoring the way Zenith was shivering beside him, their liquid body turning into a slushy, viscous consistency from the extreme cold of 15 degrees Celsius. "Thermal regulation failing," Zenith chattered, their voice shimmering with static. "The environment is aggressive." "It's just a bit of fog, Zenith. Keep moving. Movement generates heat," Kaelen commanded. They weren't alone. Other squads were scattered across the entry clearing. Most were already in their high-tech environmental suits, clunky white exoskeletons that looked like they belonged in a deep space vacuum, not a forest. A loud, booming horn sounded. Silas's voice projected across the dome. "The simulation has begun. You have 72 hours to reach the extraction point on the far side of the mountain range. Food is scarce. Water is untreated. Predators are simulated but programmed with full tactical aggression. Good luck, survivors." Immediately, chaos broke out. A squad of Volthari panicked as a simulated wind gust knocked over one of their members. They began screaming into their comms, calling for emergency extraction before they'd even walked 100 meters. "Look at them," Kaelen muttered, watching a luminette try to use a laser cutter to chop down a sapling, nearly setting its own suit on fire in the process. "They're treating a forest like a combat zone." "Is it not?" Zenith asked, huddling close to Kaelen's leg. The human's body heat was like a furnace to the Oryx. "No, it's a grocery store, a hardware shop, and a bedroom," Kaelen said. He looked at the mountain in the distance. The clouds were darkening. A real storm was rolling in, something the simulation hadn't planned, or perhaps Silas had dialed it up to see who would break. "Zenith, check the atmospheric pressure. Tell me if it's dropping." Zenith's internal sensors pulsed. "Rapidly. We are looking at a high-velocity moisture event, what the humans call heavy rain." "Great," Kaelen grunted, tightening his laces. "Rain means mud. Mud means the suits are going to get stuck. We need to move now, while the ground is still firm." As they started toward the tree line, a scream echoed through the clearing. One of the predators, a robotic construct draped in synthetic fur and teeth, leaped from the brush. It was a Gorgon Hound, a Class 5 threat designed to test defensive formations. It wasn't heading for Kaelen. It was heading for a group of 3 small, avian-like students who had collapsed in terror, their wings tangled in their gear. Kaelen didn't think. He didn't check his points or his grade. He dropped his pack. "Vance, what are you doing?" Zenith cried. "The protocol says to ignore other squads to ensure our own survival." "Screw the protocol," Kaelen spat. He bolted. In Earth's gravity, he was a fast runner. In the biodome's 0.8 gravity, he was a blur. He cleared 20 meters in 3 strides, his heavy boots thumping against the moss. The Gorgon Hound lunged, its metallic jaws snapping inches from the avian student's face. Kaelen didn't use a weapon. He used his weight. He tackled the machine mid-air, 190 pounds of Deathworlder muscle colliding with the synthetic beast. They rolled through the mud, a tangle of limbs and sparks. The robot was programmed to overpower alien physiology. It expected soft membranes or brittle crystals. It didn't expect a human. Kaelen pinned the beast, his hands gripping its cold metallic neck. The robot whirred, its motors straining, but Kaelen's grip was absolute. He felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the fight or flight that had kept his ancestors alive against lions and bears. With a grunt of effort, he twisted. The robot's neck joint snapped with a satisfying crack. The red light in its eyes flickered and died. Kaelen stood up, wiping mud from his forehead. He looked at the 3 avian students. They were staring at him with wide, terrified eyes. Not at the robot he'd killed, but at him. You killed it," one of them chirped, their voice trembling. "With your bare hands." "It was just a machine," Kaelen said, his breathing barely elevated. "Get up. The rain is coming. If you stay here, you're going to catch a cold, and in those suits, you'll be dead weight." He turned back to find Zenith standing a few meters away. The Oryx's body was a bright, glowing gold, a sign of absolute, unadulterated shock. "Vance," Zenith whispered through the comms, "I just ran the numbers on that maneuver. The force required to snap that neck. You should have broken your own arms. Kaelen picked up his rucksack and slung it over his shoulder. "Welcome to being a human, Zenith," he said, heading into the dark woods. "We're built a little different." Behind them, the first drops of rain began to fall, and the rest of the academy watched the monitors in horrified silence, wondering if they had invited a student into their midst or a force of nature they couldn't control. The rain wasn't just falling, it was reclaiming the world. Within 2 hours of the simulation's start, the biodome's climate control had shifted from a scripted challenge to a chaotic atmospheric event. Sheets of gray water slammed against the giant ferns, turning the forest floor into a treacherous slurry of mud and rotted mulch. Kaelen Vance moved through the deluge with a rhythmic, hip-swinging stride designed to keep his center of gravity low. Beside him, Zenith was struggling. The Oryx's liquid form was sloshing violently inside their membrane, their internal glow fading to a sickly, pale violet. "Vance. Sensors indicate. Thermal drain is exceeding. Metabolic recovery," Zenith chattered, the translation cuff struggling with the static of the storm. "I am becoming too viscous to flow." Kaelen stopped and looked at the blue being. Zenith was basically turning into a giant slushy. If they reached the freezing point, the Oryx would crystallize, and their internal neural nodes would shatter. "Hang tight, Zenith. We're not checking out yet," Kaelen said, his voice a low growl against the thunder. He grabbed Zenith's upper membrane. It felt like cold, wet silicone, and hoisted the alien onto his shoulders. "Wrap yourself around my neck. Use my body heat. It's a free heater, courtesy of Earth's high-octane metabolism." Zenith didn't argue. They draped their liquid limbs around Kaelen's collar, shivering as the heat from the human's carotid artery began to seep into their core. "You are incredibly inefficient at energy retention," Zenith murmured, their glow warming slightly. "You waste so much heat on the environment." "Yeah, well, that waste is what's keeping you from turning into an ice cube, so don't knock it," Kaelen replied. They crested a ridge, looking down into a valley where the simulation's safe zone was supposed to be. Instead of a glowing beacon, Kaelen saw fire. Not the controlled campfire he had built in the hall, but the jagged, angry orange of an electrical explosion. One of the massive environmental pylons had collapsed, its sparking wires whipping through the air like lethal snakes. "That's not scripted," Kaelen muttered, squinting through the rain. "Silas wouldn't risk the hardware. Something's glitched." He pulled his datapad from his pocket. The screen flickered with red warnings. "System override. Manual extraction disabled. Emergency beacons offline." "Zenith, talk to me. Can you ping the station?" The Oryx's internal nodes pulsed rapidly. "Negative. The mesh network is dark. It is as if the entire biodome has been surgically removed from the Aethelgard mainframe. This is not a malfunction, Vance. This is a blackout. A total blackout." Kaelen's military instincts, buried under years of exile and bitterness, flared to life. A blackout in a high-security academy during a survival trial wasn't an accident. It was a tactical window. "We need to find the others," Kaelen said, his jaw tightening. "Why?" Zenith asked, their voice small. "The mission is to reach the extraction point. We should move faster while the others are bogged down." Kaelen looked at a group of students huddled under a collapsing lean-to 50 meters away. They were Volthari, their crystalline bodies cracked from the thermal shock of the rain, huddling together in a pile of useless glass. "Because they're going to die, Zenith," Kaelen said. "This isn't a game anymore. If the pylons are blowing, the life support in this dome is going to flip. The temperature will drop to 40 degrees below zero, or spike to 100 in an hour. They don't have the kit for that. We do. You have a knife and a rope, Vance, Zenith pointed out. The others have environmental suits. Suits that run on the station's power grid, Kaelen countered. No grid, no heat. No heat. They're just wearing expensive coffins. He started down the slope, his boots sinking 6 inches into the mud with every step. He reached the Volthari group. They were a mess. Their leader, a tall, jagged being named Crix, was trying to activate a beacon that was clearly dead. "Hey, Crix, drop the junk!" Kaelen shouted over the wind. The Volthari turned, his facets dull with terror. "The human! Stay back! Your heat! It will cause thermal expansion! You will shatter us!" "Listen to me, you overgrown paperweight." Kaelen stepped closer, ignoring the warning. "Your suits are dead. The station is dark. If you stay in this valley, the runoff is going to bury you in a mudslide in 20 minutes. Follow me to the high ground. There's a cave system 3 kilometers north." "3 kilometers?" Crix shrieked, his voice like grinding stones. "In this gravity, in this fluid-heavy atmosphere. Impossible. We will wait for the drones." "The drones aren't coming!" Kaelen grabbed Crix by the shoulder, a move that would have been an act of war in a classroom, but here was a desperate wake-up call. "Look at the sky, Crix. The sun sim is flickering. When that goes out, it's midnight on a dead moon. You want to be here for that?" As if on cue, the giant artificial sun overhead sputtered. The golden light turned a bruised, sickly violet, then vanished. Darkness slammed down on the biodome like a physical weight. The only light came from the sparks of the dying pylon and the terrified, flickering bioluminescence of the students. The screaming started then. It was a high-pitched, multitonal sound of hundreds of sentient beings realizing they were no longer at the top of the food chain. "Zenith," Kaelen said, his voice calm, an anchor in the storm. "Use your internal nodes. Give me a low-frequency pulse. I need to see the terrain." "I am not a flashlight, Vance," Zenith protested, but their core began to glow a steady, soft blue. "Close enough. Crix, grab your people. Link arms. If one of you falls, the others pull. We move in a file. If I hear anyone stop, I'm coming back there, and you won't like the Deathworlder version of a pep talk. Clear?" Crix looked at the darkness, then at the fire, and finally at the human who seemed entirely unfazed by the end of the world. "Understood," the Volthari whispered. They began the climb. It was a slow, agonizing process. Kaelen led the way, using his knife to hack through the thick vine-like weeds that had become slick with grease. He was carrying Zenith on his shoulders and pulling Crix by a length of rope. Behind Crix, 4 more Volthari stumbled, their crystalline feet slipping on the stones. 20 meters more!" Kaelen yelled. "Keep the rhythm! Left, right, breathe! Left, right, breathe!" My cooling vents are clogged with silt," one of the Volthari wailed. "I am overheating internally." "Then vent it," Kaelen barked. "Use the pain. Focus on the next step." He felt the fatigue creeping into his own thighs. Earth's gravity was 1.0, and this was only 0.8. But the mud acted like a suction cup, draining his strength with every lift. His heart hammered against his ribs, a steady, drum-like beat of 300 million years of evolution, saying not today. They reached a shelf of rock. Kaelen scanned the area with Zenith's blue light. There, tucked behind a curtain of heavy moss, was the entrance to a natural cavern. It wasn't part of the simulation's safe zones. It was a geological fluke of the dome's construction. "Inside! Move!" He shoved the Volthari into the cave. It was dry, the air smelling of ancient stone and dust. As the last alien scrambled inside, Kaelen collapsed against the wall, his lungs burning. He took a long, shaky breath, tasting the copper of overexertion in his mouth. "Vance, your biometrics," Zenith whispered, sliding off his shoulders. "Your core temperature is skyrocketing. You are redlining." "I'm fine," Kaelen wheezed. "Just give me a minute." In the darkness of the cave, the Volthari began to dim their lights to conserve energy. They sat in a circle, their jagged forms casting strange shadows. "Why?" Crix asked quietly. "Why did you save us? We were the ones who signed the petition to have you removed. We called your species unstable biological hazards." Kaelen looked at the cave entrance, where the storm continued to howl. "On Earth, we have a saying. The mountain doesn't care who your father was. When the world turns into a meat grinder, you either help the person next to you, or you're just more meat for the grinder. I don't care about your petitions, Crix. I care about getting out of this dome. But you could have moved twice as fast without us," Crix persisted. "Your survival probability would have increased by 60%. Kaelen looked at his calloused hands, then at Zenith, who was huddling in a puddle of their own blue light. "Maybe," Kaelen said. "But then I'd be alone, and alone is just a slow way of dying." Suddenly, the ground shook. A deep, mechanical groan vibrated through the rock. "What was that?" Zenith asked, their glow flickering with alarm. Kaelen stood up, his hand moving to the hilt of his knife. "That wasn't the storm. That was the station's docking clamps. Something just latched onto the biodome from the outside." He looked at the frightened students. The assignment had just turned into a war zone. The docking sound had been followed by a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure on the eardrums. Inside the cave, the 7 students, 5 Volthari, 1 Oryx, and 1 human, held their breath. "Zenith," Kaelen whispered, "can you interface with the cave's internal sensors? There has to be a maintenance line somewhere in the bedrock." The blue liquid being flowed toward the back of the cave, their translucent tendrils probing the cracks in the stone. "Searching. Searching. Ah, I have a parasitic connection. Vance, this is bad. Very bad." "Give it to me straight. No sugar-coating," Kaelen said, checking the edge of his blade with his thumb. "The station's primary AI, Aegis, has been lobotomized. A third-party virus has seized control of the biodome's independent life support. The docking sound we heard? It was a Vulture-class boarding craft. They're not from the Sovereignty. The signature is the Obsidian Fang." Kaelen cursed under his breath. The Obsidian Fang was a notorious mercenary syndicate, a collection of scavengers and pirates who specialized in kidnapping high-value targets. An academy full of the children of the Hexad's elite was the ultimate payday. "They think they're walking into a simulation," Kaelen muttered. "They think they're just going to pick up a bunch of terrified kids in fancy suits." "They are picking up a bunch of terrified kids," Crix snapped, his crystal facets rattling. "We have no weapons. Our suits are powerless. We are prey." Kaelen turned on the Volthari leader, his eyes narrowing. "Listen to me, Crix. In my world, prey is just a predator that hasn't found a weapon yet. You're made of living quartz. You weigh 400 pounds. You can crush a bulkhead if you hit it hard enough. Stop thinking like a victim and start thinking like a problem." "But the mercenaries, they will have plasma rifles, kinetic shields." "They have technology," Kaelen countered. "We have the terrain, and they don't know I'm here. They've looked at the rosters. They see a bunch of Class 1 and 2 pacifists. They aren't expecting a Deathworlder who's spent the last 10 years hunting things that would make their Fang mercenaries look like house cats. He turned to Zenith. Can you loop the sensor feed? Make it look like this cave is empty? I can ghost the signature for maybe 20 minutes, Zenith said. But Vance, what are you going to do? You are only one human. I'm going to go shopping, Kaelen said, a grim, jagged smile touching his face. Crix, I need 2 of your people to stay at the entrance. Use your natural camouflage. If anyone comes near, don't fight. Just whistle, low and long. Zenith, you're with me. I need your interface skills. I am not designed for stealth operations, Zenith protested, but they flowed into a compact dark blue sphere and tucked themselves into Kaelen's rucksack. Kaelen stepped out of the cave. The storm had passed, replaced by a thick, oppressive fog that clung to the trees. The artificial sun was still dark, but the mercenaries had deployed orbital flares, harsh, flickering white lights that drifted through the canopy like malevolent eyes. He moved through the underbrush with the silence of a ghost. His years in the Siberian dead zone had taught him that sound was a death sentence. He stepped on rocks, not twigs. He moved when the wind rustled the leaves, masking his own noise. He reached the valley floor. 3 mercenaries were standing near a downed evacuation pod. They were Skrull, 6-limbed insectoid beings with chitinous armor and multi-lensed eyes. They were laughing, their vocal cords clicking with a sound like breaking dry bone. Easiest credits of the cycle, one of them clicked in galactic trade speak. Look at this one. It's still crying in its suit. Should we spice it up? Maybe break a wing before we crate it? Kaelen felt a cold, sharp anger bloom in his chest. It was the kind of anger that didn't make you scream. It made you precise. Zenith, Kaelen whispered into his collar. Can you kill the power to their flares? All at once? I can try. I have to pulse the localized mesh. It will drain my core energy. I will be incapacitated for several minutes. Do it on my mark, Kaelen said. He drew his knife. It was a simple carbon steel blade, 18 inches long, weighted for throwing. It didn't glow. It didn't hum. It just cut. He crept within 5 meters of the Skrull. They were distracted, poking at a terrified student with the barrel of a plasma carbine. Mark! Kaelen breathed. The white flares overhead died instantly. Total, absolute darkness reclaimed the valley. The Skrull shrieked, their multi-lensed eyes struggling to adjust to the sudden lack of photons. Light! Get the thermals online. What happened to... Kaelen was already moving. He didn't go for the gun. He went for the throat. He drove the knife into the soft, unarmored joint of the lead Skrull's neck. There was a wet, crunching sound, and the mercenary slumped without a cry. The second Skrull turned, its 4 arms fumbling for a sidearm. Kaelen didn't wait. He delivered a brutal sidelong kick to the creature's lower knee. The chitin shattered with a sound like a car crash. As the Skrull collapsed, Kaelen grabbed its head and slammed it against the pod's reinforced hull. 1, 2, silence. The third mercenary fired blindly into the dark. Pew, pew! The plasma bolts hissed through the air, melting the leaves of a nearby fern. Kaelen dropped low, sliding through the mud. He grabbed a heavy rock and threw it into the bushes 5 meters to the left. The Skrull swung its rifle toward the noise. I see you. I'll melt your... Kaelen rose from the shadows behind it. He wrapped his arm around the creature's neck, his biceps squeezing against its windpipe. The Skrull thrashed, its 4 claws digging into Kaelen's forearms, tearing through his jacket and drawing blood. Kaelen didn't let go. He leaned back, using his superior weight and the leverage of his Deathworlder skeletal structure. He twisted. Snap! The third mercenary went limp. Kaelen stood there, breathing hard, his arms dripping with ichor and his own red blood. He looked down at the unconscious student in the pod, a small, furry being who was now staring at him with a mixture of worship and horror. You killed them, the student whispered. You fought 3 Skrull without a suit. They were sloppy, Kaelen said, his voice flat. He picked up one of the plasma carbines. It felt light, flimsy. Zenith, you still with me? The Oryx crawled out of the pack, their blue light dim and flickering. Vance, that was statistically impossible. The Skrull are warrior caste. Their reaction times are 19 milliseconds. 19 milliseconds doesn't matter if you're looking the wrong way, Kaelen said. He checked the magazine of the carbine. We have 3 guns now, and a radio. He keyed the mercenary's frequency. Sector 4 clear. We've got the Luminet Prince. Moving to the secondary pickup. Where's the human? The report said there was a human on the roster. Forget the human. Another voice clicked over the air. Probably drowned in a puddle by now. Their planet is mostly water, right? They're soft. Focus on the crystals. They're worth more. Kaelen turned off the radio. He looked back toward the cave where Crix and the others were waiting. Zenith, he said, his voice dropping into a dangerous low register. Change of plans. We're not just surviving anymore. What? What are we doing? We're going to show them what soft looks like, Kaelen said. We're going to hunt the hunters. He looked at the small student he'd just rescued. Can you walk? I think so. Good. Take these 2 extra rifles. Go to the cave at the North Ridge. Tell the Volthari named Crix that the Deathworlder sent you. Tell him it's time to stop being prey. As the student scurried away into the fog, Kaelen Vance checked his wounds. The scratches on his arms were deep, but the blood was already beginning to clot. His body, forged in the brutal competitive crucible of Earth, was already repairing the damage. He felt a strange, grim satisfaction. For years, he had been told that his nature was a curse, that he was a relic of a violent, primitive past. But as he melted back into the shadows of the biodome, he realized that in a galaxy of glass and light, sometimes you needed a bit of iron. Come on, Zenith, he whispered. Let's go give these obsidian boys a lesson in kinetic friction. The mist in the biodome had thickened into a soup of gray particles, smelling of ozone and wet chitin. Kaelen Vance crouched in the hollow of a massive synthetic baobab tree, his breathing shallow and synchronized with the swaying of the branches. Beside him, Zenith was a muted navy blue, their liquid body vibrating with a frequency that Kaelen could feel through the soles of his boots. Vance! Zenith's voice came through the bone conduction headset, a ghost of a sound. The mercenary frequency is spiking. They have found the empty evacuation pods in Sector 7. They are perturbed. They used the term ghost shifter to describe what killed their scouts. Let them be perturbed, Kaelen whispered, checking the charge pack on the stolen Skrull carbine. Fear makes them sloppy. Sloppy makes them loud. But they are gathering, Kaelen. They are no longer searching in pairs. They have formed a tactical wedge. 20 mercenaries, armored, moving toward the ridge. If they reach the cave... They won't, Kaelen cut in. He looked at his hands. The blood from the Skrull scratches had dried into dark, jagged crusts. Because we're going to turn this paradise into a meat grinder. Zenith, I need you to drop the I'm just a scientist act for 10 minutes. Can you interface with the dome's irrigation subroutines? Zenith's internal nodes pulsed a skeptical violet. The irrigation system? Kaelen? Those are just water sprayers. They are designed for gentle hydration of the flora. On Earth, anything under pressure is a weapon, Kaelen said, his eyes scanning the fog. If you can override the safety valves and dump the entire reserve into the Sector 6 drainage pipes, we can turn that slope into a slide. We don't need to shoot them all. We just need to break their formation. It is unethical, Zenith murmured, to use a life-sustaining system for harm. Kaelen turned, his face inches from the Oryx's membrane. Unethical? Zenith, they're caging your classmates like livestock. They're going to sell them to the highest bidder in the Outer Rim. You want to talk about ethics, or you want to talk about survival? Because in a minute, those ethics are going to get Crix and the others killed. The Oryx went silent. The blue liquid within them surged, a stormy, turbulent motion. I will attempt the override. But Kaelen, if I do this, am I still a scientist? Or am I like you? Kaelen felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in years. Guilt. He was dragging a creature of pure logic and peace into his world of dirt and violence. You're a survivor, Zenith. That's the only title that matters right now. He left Zenith at the junction box and moved toward the ridge. He didn't have much time. He could hear the heavy, rhythmic thumping of mercenary boots. The Skrull were fast, but they were heavy, and the biodome's floor wasn't built for a squad in full combat gear. Kaelen reached a narrow pass where the trail hugged the side of a synthetic cliff. Below was a drop of 30 meters into a cluster of jagged, decorative obsidian rocks. This was the bottleneck. He pulled a length of high-tensile climbing rope from his pack, the one thing he'd insisted on bringing from Earth. He tied one end to a sturdy root and looped the rest across the path, burying it under a thin layer of moss and silt. It was a primitive tripwire, something a Roman legionnaire would have recognized. Vance, Zenith's voice crackled. Pressure is critical. I am dumping the reserves, now. A deep subterranean thrum shook the ground. High above, the irrigation pipes groaned. Suddenly, the gentle hydration system turned into a series of water cannons. Thousands of gallons of water erupted from the hillside, turning the dirt trail into a roaring river of mud. Kaelen heard the shouts of the mercenaries. What is this? The climate control is... Thud. The lead Skrull, blinded by the sudden deluge and the mud, hit Kaelen's tripwire at full tilt. Its massive, armored body flipped forward, its 4 secondary arms flailing for purchase that didn't exist. It slid off the edge of the cliff with a metallic shriek, vanishing into the fog below. The rest of the squad scrambled to a halt, their boots skidding in the slurry. Ambush! The mercenary captain clicked. Thermal sweep! Find the... Kaelen didn't give them the chance. He rose from the brush, not with a gun, but with a handful of biophotic flares he'd modified. He cracked them and threw them into the center of the squad. The flares didn't just glow. They erupted in a blinding magnesium-white flash. To humans, it was a nuisance. To the Skrull, whose eyes were evolved for the dim light of asteroid mines, it was a sensory lobotomy. My eyes, I can't see. Kaelen moved in. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He was a predator. He used the butt of the stolen carbine to shatter the breathing apparatus of the nearest Skrull. He didn't kill, he didn't have the time, but he disabled. A broken leg here, a smashed sensor array there. He was a whirlwind of brown and gray in the white light. But then, the world exploded. A plasma bolt, fired blindly by a panicked mercenary, hit the tree next to Kaelen's head. The heat was instantaneous. Thousands of degrees of ionized gas turning the wood into splinters and searing the side of Kaelen's face. He tumbled backward, his vision swimming in red and black. His skin felt like it was being peeled off with a hot iron. "Kaelen!" Zenith screamed over the link. Kaelen crawled into the hollow of the rocks, his breath coming in ragged, agonized gasps. He touched his face. His fingertips came away wet with blood and charred skin. The Deathworlder was human after all. He was breakable. The mercenaries were recovering. Their captain, a scarred scrawl with a cybernetic eye, stepped through the mud, his heavy rifle leveled at the rocks where Kaelen was hiding. "I know you're there, human," the captain clicked, his voice cold and dripping with malice. "You've been a real pain in the thorax, but you're out of tricks. Come out, or I'll burn this entire ridge until you're nothing but ash." Kaelen looked at his carbine. It was jammed with mud. He looked at his knife. It was 10 feet away, dropped during the blast. He was cornered. He was alone. But then a shadow fell over the path. It wasn't a human shadow. It was jagged, crystalline, and massive. Crix, the Volthari leader, stepped out of the fog. Behind him stood the other 4 Volthari, their bodies glowing with a fierce, angry light Kaelen had never seen. They weren't huddling. They weren't crying. "Leave! The human! Alone!" Crix ground out, his voice like 2 tectonic plates rubbing together. The Skrull captain laughed. "Or what, Crystal Boy? You're going to shine at me? Get out of the way before I turn you into gravel." "We are Volthari," Crix said, stepping forward. The mud didn't seem to bother him. His sheer weight anchored him to the stone. "We were born in the pressure of a dying star's core. You think your little heat gun scares us?" The Skrull fired. The plasma bolt hit Crix square in the chest. The Volthari didn't fall. The crystal where the bolt hit turned a blinding, incandescent white, absorbing the energy. Crix roared, a sound of pure, crystalline resonance that shattered the glass sensors on the mercenaries' helmets. "Now!" Crix shouted. The Volthari charged. They didn't use guns. They used their mass. They were 400-pound boulders of sentient quartz slamming into the lightweight insectoids. Chitin snapped. Armor buckled. The Skrull, used to fighting enemies who surrendered at the first sign of violence, were being pulverized by a race of pacifists who had finally found something worth fighting for. Kaelen watched, dazed, as Crix reached the Skrull captain. The mercenary tried to reload, but Crix grabbed the rifle with one hand and crushed the barrel like it was made of tin. With the other hand, he picked the Skrull up by the waist and hurled him into the forest. The remaining mercenaries, seeing their captain tossed aside like a toy, turned and fled into the darkness. Silence returned to the ridge, save for the heavy, rhythmic thrumming of the Volthari's hearts. Crix walked over to Kaelen and knelt. His chest was still glowing where the plasma had hit, a jagged scar of fused glass marking the spot. You came back," Kaelen wheezed, clutching his burned face. "You said—" "We had to stop being prey," Crix said. He reached out a stony hand and gently, incredibly gently, helped Kaelen to his feet. "We decided. We liked being problems more." Kaelen leaned against the Volthari, his strength failing. He looked at the group of students. They were covered in mud and ichor, their faces set in grim lines. The innocence of the academy was gone, replaced by the hard, cold reality of the struggle. "We need to move," Kaelen whispered. "They'll be back, and next time, they'll bring the heavy stuff." "Then we will be ready," Crix said. But as they started back toward the cave, Kaelen saw Zenith. The Oryx was standing by the irrigation junction, their body a dull, lifeless gray. They weren't moving. They weren't pulsing. Zenith? Kaelen called out. The Oryx looked up. Their internal nodes were dim. Kaelen, I killed them. The ones who slid off the cliff. I checked the sensors. They didn't make it. I used the water, and I killed them. Kaelen stopped. The adrenaline was fading, leaving only the cold ache of his burns and the weight of what they had done. They were going to kill us, Zenith, Kaelen said, his voice soft. I know, Zenith whispered, but I can't. I can't feel the math anymore. All I can feel is the cold. Is this what it's like? Being a Deathworlder? Kaelen looked at the blue being, seeing the fracture in their soul. He didn't have an answer. Because the truth was, being a Deathworlder wasn't about the strength to kill. It was about the strength to live with the fact that you had to. And Kaelen wasn't sure if he wanted Zenith to learn that lesson. By the time they reached the cave, the temperature in the biodome had begun to drop. With the environmental pylons damaged and the irrigation reserves dumped, the artificial ecosystem was collapsing into a flash freeze cycle. Frost began to bloom on the giant ferns, turning the lush green world into a jagged landscape of white and gray. Inside the cavern, the mood had shifted from panic to a grim military focus. There were now 19 students in the cave, Kaelen's original group, plus the ones he and the Volthari had rescued during the skirmish on the ridge. Kaelen sat in the back, away from the light. One side of his face was covered in a makeshift bandage of biogel and moss. Every breath felt like inhaling ground glass, but he couldn't show it. He was the Deathworlder. He was the anchor. If he cracked, the whole group would shatter. Vance, a voice chirped. It was Chun, the small avian student Kaelen had saved from the first Gorgon hound. He was holding a bowl of heated nutrient paste. You need to eat. Your metabolism. It's burning through your reserves. Kaelen took the bowl with a shaking hand. Thanks, kid. How are the others? Scared. But different, Tyun said, sitting on a rock nearby. Crix is teaching the others how to harden their outer shells. The luminettes are pooling their energy to keep the cave warm. We're a hive now. Like back on my home nest. Kaelen nodded, but his eyes were on Zenith. The Oryx was sitting in the furthest corner, their liquid body nearly motionless. They hadn't spoken since the ridge. He's taking it hard, Tujun whispered, following Kaelen's gaze. The Oryx. They don't have a concept for justifiable force. To them, taking a life is like breaking a fundamental law of physics. It's not a choice. It's a malfunction. I broke him, Kaelen said, his voice a low rasp. I pushed him to do it. I thought I was saving him. You did save him, Tujun said firmly. And us. But Kaelen, you can't carry the weight of everyone's soul. That's a Deathworlder habit, isn't it? Trying to be the shield for everyone else? Kaelen didn't answer. He finished the paste and stood up, his joints protesting. He needed to check the perimeter. The Obsidian Fang wouldn't just give up. They had a contract, and mercenaries didn't get paid for almost kidnapping a prince. He walked to the cave entrance. Crix was there, his stony face illuminated by the faint violet glow of the dying dome. The air is changing, Crix said. The nitrogen mix is thinning. The mercenaries are pumping something into the ventilation shafts. Kaelen sniffed the air. There was a faint, sweet smell, like rotting jasmine. He knew that smell. Soporific gas. They're trying to knock us out so they can just walk in and bag us up. Low risk, high reward. What do we do? Crix asked. We cannot seal the cave. We would suffocate. We go out, Kaelen said. One last time, but we don't go as a squad. We go as a ghost. He turned to the gathered students. Listen up. The Fang is coming. They think they can put us to sleep and take us home like trophies. But we've got something they don't. We've got the assignment. We're going to use everything we've learned in this class, the fire, the gravity, the environment, and we're going to make them regret they ever heard the name Aethelgard. He looked at Zenith. Zenith, I need you. One more time. No killing. Just distraction. Can you do that? Zenith's nodes flickered, a slow, hesitant pulse. I will try, Kaelen. For the hive. Kaelen began to hand out tasks. He was using the sprinkle method of leadership, giving them just enough information to keep them focused, but not enough to overwhelm them. He taught the avians how to drop sting fruit from the heights. He showed the luminettes how to strobe their light to disorient the Skrull's multi-lensed eyes. It was a symphony of survival, a blending of Earth's grit and the sovereignty's strange alien abilities. But the cost was already showing. Kaelen could see the exhaustion in their eyes. He could see the way Crix's crystalline skin was dulling, the energy drain of the plasma hit taking its toll. He could see the way Zenith's membrane was thinning, the stress of the situation literally pulling them apart. Is this the lesson? Kaelen wondered. That to survive, you have to lose the very thing that makes you worth saving? He pushed the thought away. There would be time for philosophy when they were back in the station. Or dead. Move out, Kaelen commanded. They emerged into a world of white. The flash freeze had turned the biodome into a crystal palace of lethal beauty. The trees were encased in ice, their branches snapping under the weight like gunshots. The fog had frozen into tiny needles of frost that stung the skin. The mercenaries were approaching. They were using sled drones, heavy, hovering platforms armed with stun cannons and containment nets. There were 30 of them now, moving in a tight professional formation. Luminettes! Now! Kaelen signaled. 5 energy beings erupted from the trees, their bodies flashing in a chaotic stroboscopic pattern. The Skrull mercenaries recoiled, their visors struggling to compensate for the light. Fire! The mercenary leader shouted. The stun cannons roared, blue bolts of electricity tearing through the trees. But the students weren't there. They were moving through the canopy, the avians carrying the lighter students, the Volthari acting as living shields for the ones on the ground. Kaelen was in the middle of it, a shadow among shadows. He moved with a brutal, efficient grace, using a stolen Skrull shield to deflect the bolts while he closed the distance. He reached the first sled drone. He didn't use a gun. He jumped onto the platform, his weight throwing the delicate hover stabilizers out of alignment. He grabbed the Skrull pilot and threw him off, then jammed his knife into the drone's power core. The drone erupted in a spray of blue sparks, spinning out of control and slamming into a second platform. "Keep it up!" Kaelen yelled. "Don't let them stabilize!" But the Obsidian Fang was starting to adapt. They weren't just scouts. They were veterans of 100 skirmishes. They formed a circle of steel, their shields overlapping, their fire becoming more disciplined. "They're pinning us down!" Crix shouted, his body cracked and bleeding energy. "Kaelen, we can't get through!" Kaelen looked at the wall of shields. He looked at his exhausted students. They were at the limit. One more push, and they would break. "Zenith," Kaelen whispered. "The irrigation pipes. The main tank. Is it still pressurized?" "Yes," Zenith's voice was weak. "But Kaelen, if I blow the main tank, the entire Sector 6 will collapse. The weight of the water, the ice. It will destroy everything, including us." "Not if we're in the cave," Kaelen said. "But someone has to stay behind to trigger the manual release. The remote link is dead." There was a long silence. "I will do it," Zenith said. "No," Kaelen snapped. "You're too weak. You won't make it back." I am already broken, Kaelen, Zenith said, their voice suddenly clear and calm. You taught me that. Survival is the only math that matters. But I think you were wrong. I think the only math that matters is who gets to survive. The oryx flowed out of the rucksack before Kaelen could stop them. They moved like a streak of blue light toward the irrigation control tower, 100 meters away, directly in the line of fire. Zenith! Get back here! Kaelen screamed. He started to run after them, but a volley of plasma fire forced him down. The mercenaries had seen the blue streak and were pouring fire onto the tower. Protect the oryx! Crix roared, the Volthari throwing themselves into the line of fire to create a corridor of crystal. Zenith reached the tower. Their body was riddled with holes from the kinetic rounds, their blue liquid leaking onto the ice like spilled ink. They reached the manual lever. They looked back at Kaelen. For a brief second, their nodes pulsed a warm, soft pink, the oryx color for gratitude. Calculations complete, Zenith whispered. They pulled the lever. The world turned into a roar of white. The main irrigation tank, holding 100,000 gallons of pressurized water, disintegrated. A wall of water and ice, 60 feet high, erupted from the tower, a tidal wave of destruction that swept through the valley. The mercenaries were gone in an instant, buried under thousands of tons of ice and slush. The sled drones were crushed like soda cans. Kaelen grabbed Crix and the others, diving back into the deep recesses of the cave as the mouth of the cavern was buried under a 10-foot wall of frozen debris. Then there was only the sound of the wind and the slow, heavy drip of melting ice. Kaelen sat in the darkness, his hand clutching the empty rucksack where Zenith had been just minutes ago. He looked at his students, the survivors. They were safe. The mercenaries were defeated. The assignment was over. But the silence in the cave was heavier than the ice outside. Kaelen leaned his head against the cold stone, the tears stinging his burned face. He had taught them how to survive. He had taught them how to fight. He had shown them the power of the Deathworlder. And in return, the universe had taken the one thing that had made the struggle worth it. Zenith, he whispered into the dark. But there was no answer, only the cold and the math of the dead. The silence inside the cave was not empty. It was a heavy, suffocating thing that tasted of damp stone and the metallic tang of dried blood. Kaelen Vance sat against the far wall, his hands buried in the coarse fabric of his empty rucksack. The biogel on his face had hardened into a stiff, itchy mask, but he didn't strip it off. The pain was a grounding wire, the only thing keeping his mind from drifting into the whiteout of the valley outside. Around him, the 18 survivors were huddled in small, rhythmic clusters. The Volthari had dimmed their bioluminescence to a faint, pulsing amber, their stony carapaces covered in a fine layer of frost. Crix sat nearest to the entrance, his jagged shoulder cracked where a kinetic slug had grazed him. He looked less like a noble student of the Hexad, and more like a piece of debris salvaged from a shipyard explosion. "He's not coming back, is he?" Joan whispered. The avian student was plucking nervously at a broken primary feather on his wing. His voice was thin, brittle as dry glass. Kaelen didn't look up. "Zenith did what he had to do, kid. He ran the numbers and decided we were worth the trade." "But he was a scientist," Jun persisted, a hooting sob catching in his throat. "He wasn't supposed to be a martyr. We weren't supposed to be soldiers." "Welcome to the real galaxy," Kaelen snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. "It doesn't care what you were supposed to be. It only cares if you're still breathing when the sun goes down." Crix turned his heavy, crystalline head toward Kaelen. "Is that what they taught you on Earth, Vance? That survival, is a zero-sum game? That for us to sit here in the dark, Zenith had to be erased? Kaelen finally looked up. His one good eye was bloodshot, burning with a cold, weary fire. On Earth, we don't have the luxury of philosophy when the wolves are at the door. You do the math, or you become the meal. Zenith learned that. He learned it too fast, and he learned it from me. You want to blame someone? Blame the guy who taught him how to pull the lever. I do not blame you for the lever, Crix ground out, his voice a low vibration in the floor. I blame you for the hollow. You saved our lives, human, but you did it by turning us into mirrors of yourself. Look at them. Kaelen looked. He saw the students, beings of light, water, and air, clutching stolen scrawl carbines with white-knuckled grips. He saw the way they flinched at every groan of the ice outside. Their innocence hadn't just been lost. It had been cauterized. I did what I had to, Kaelen muttered, pulling his knees to his chest. I got you through. The radio he had taken from the scrawl captain crackled suddenly, the static a jagged tear in the quiet. Sector 6. Come in. Sector 6. Report status of the prince. Kaelen grabbed the device, his thumb hovering over the transmit key. He didn't answer. He listened. Captain? The pylon collapse was successful, but we've lost the biometric pings of the extraction team. The human variable is exceeding projections. If the students aren't crated in 10 minutes, initiate the clean slate protocol. Kaelen froze. Clean slate. In military parlance, that usually meant one thing: burning the evidence. Zenith was right, a voice whispered from the back of the cave. Kaelen spun around. The shadows seemed to shift, and a small, translucent puddle of blue liquid began to seep from a crack in the rock wall near the irrigation interface. It was thin, pale, and barely glowing, but it moved with a familiar, erratic rhythm. Zenith? Kaelen lunged forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. The oryx didn't form a full body. He was just a fragment, a handful of sentient fluid clinging to life. A single neural node pulsed weakly in the center of the puddle. I divided. The oryx's voice came through the comlink, faint as a radio signal from a distant star. I left 10% of my mass in the interface as a failsafe. The rest is gone with the water. You crazy, magnificent bastard, Kaelen breathed, kneeling beside the puddle. He didn't try to pick him up. The oryx was too fragile, his membrane almost non-existent. Can you hear the radio? They're talking about a clean slate. I heard, Zenith whispered. I am still connected to the subgrid. Kaelen, the virus. It didn't come from the outside. The encryption keys. They belong to the High Proctor's office. The cave went ice cold. High Proctor Veltrex, the head of the academy, the one who had given the orientation speech about safety and medical teams. They sold us out, Crix roared, his crystal facets flashing a violent, angry red. They used the simulation as a marketplace. They brought the obsidian fang in to prune the weak and kidnap the heirs for ransom. It was never a class. It was a harvest. Kaelen felt a cold, familiar sensation settling in his gut. It wasn't fear. It was the absolute crystalline clarity of a man who had seen the bottom of the world and realized there was nowhere left to fall. They're going to vent the dome, Zenith said, his node flickering, to hide the bodies. They'll blame the malfunction. They'll say the Deathworlder went rogue and killed everyone, and the Proctor tried to save us by purging the environment. It's a perfect narrative. How long? Kaelen asked, his voice flat. 5 minutes. The atmosphere, it will be replaced with pure CO2. We will sleep, and then we will cease. Kaelen stood up. He looked at the 18 students. He looked at his knife, his rope, and his stolen guns. He had spent his whole life believing that survival was about being the hardest, toughest thing in the room. He had thought that by teaching these soft aliens how to be hard, he was saving them. But Zenith, even in his broken, fragmented state, had done something Kaelen never could. He had divided himself. He had given up his wholeness to save the hive. "Crix," Kaelen said, his voice echoing in the hollow, "you said I turned you into mirrors of myself. You were right. And I'm sorry. Because being a Deathworlder is a lonely way to live. But right now, we're going to use that mirror. We're going to show the proctor exactly what happens when you try to harvest a crop that has teeth." "What is the plan, Vance?" Crix asked, standing tall, his crystal frame casting a long, sharp shadow. "We aren't going to the extraction point," Kaelen said. "We're going to the command spire. It's located inside the mountain at the center of the dome. If we can seize the manual override, we can broadcast the proctor's encryption keys to the entire hexad. We don't just survive this, we burn the proctor to the ground." "The gas?" Jun stammered. "We won't make it to the spire in 5 minutes." Kaelen looked at Zenith's puddle. "Zenith, can you seal the cave's ventilation? Just for 10 minutes? Give us enough air to make the run?" "I can clog the filters with my own mass," Zenith said. "But Kaelen, if I do, I will be trapped here. When the CO2 comes, I will be the first to go." Kaelen knelt again. He reached out and touched the stone an inch away from the oryx. "No, you've given enough. I'll stay. I'll hold the seal. I'm a human. My lungs can handle a bit of bad air longer than any of you. You go with them. Crix can carry you in a sealed canister." "No," Zenith's node pulsed a firm, bright blue. "The hive needs its predator. You are the only one who can take the spire. I am a scientist. I am a failsafe. Go, Kaelen. Live. That is the only math that matters." Kaelen felt a lump in his throat he couldn't swallow. He had spent years running from his own humanity, thinking it was a weakness in the cold math of the stars. But here was a creature of liquid and light, teaching him that the greatest strength wasn't the ability to kill, but the willingness to let go. "Move out!" Kaelen barked, his voice thick. Crix scooped the remaining mass of Zenith into an airtight nutrient jar. The students formed a phalanx, their stolen weapons leveled, their eyes fixed on the distant, dark peak of the command spire. They burst out of the cave and into the frozen wasteland. The air was already starting to turn sweet. The clean slate had begun. The run to the command spire was a blur of silver frost and burning lungs. The gas was invisible, a silent thief that robbed the blood of its strength. Kaelen felt the familiar lethargy creeping into his limbs, the heaviness that preceded the long sleep of CO2 poisoning. "Don't! Stop!" He wheezed, his boots crunching through the frozen ferns. "Eyes! On the peak!" The command spire rose like a jagged needle of black obsidian from the center of the artificial mountain. It was a fortress within a cage, protected by a squad of the proctor's personal security. Not mercenaries this time, but peacekeepers in gleaming white armor, their faces hidden behind mirrored visors. "They're blocking the ramp," Chun chirped, his wings flapping uselessly in the heavy, gas-laden air. "They're peacekeepers," Crix spat, his amber light flickering dangerously. "They won't fire on us. We're students." Zip-thwip. A high-velocity kinetic round shattered the stone inches from Crix's head. "They're firing!" Kaelen yelled, diving behind a fallen log. They're all in on the clean slate. If we don't take that ramp, we're dead in 2 minutes. The peacekeepers were positioned behind reinforced barricades at the top of the ramp. They had the high ground, the superior weapons, and the masks to filter out the gas. The students were trapped in the kill zone, their stolen carbines outranged and their bodies failing. "We can't get close!" Crick shouted, his crystalline skin cracking under the barrage of kinetic fire. "Vance! We need a miracle!" Kaelen looked at the students. They were dropping. Not from the bullets, but from the gas. One by one, the luminettes were fading into dim, gray mists. The avians were curling into balls on the ice. Even Crix was down on one knee, his jagged breath sounding like a rusted saw. Kaelen felt the world tilting. The sweet smell of the gas was everywhere now, a cloying, suffocating blanket. His vision was tunneling, the black spire becoming a tiny dot at the end of a long, dark hallway. "This is it," he thought. The Deathworlder dies in a box, far from home, protecting people who used to hate him. But then he felt a vibration in his pocket. It was the nutrient jar. Zenith. "Kaelen," the voice whispered in his ear cuff. "The gravity pylon. Behind the barricade. It's unshielded." Kaelen squinted through the haze. There, behind the peacekeepers, was a pulsing blue column of light, the device that maintained the dome's 0.8 gravity. "If you disrupt it," Zenith wheezed, "the gravity will snap back to station standard. 5 Gs for a microsecond. It will crush the suits." "It'll crush us too, Zenith," Kaelen groaned. "No, you are a Deathworlder. Your bones are reinforced. Your heart is a pump for a monster. You will survive the snap. They will not." Kaelen looked at his friends. They were already unconscious. They wouldn't feel the snap. They would just be pinned to the floor. But he would have to be the one to pull the trigger. He would have to be the one to weather the storm. "Do it," Kaelen whispered. He stood up. The peacekeepers saw him, a solitary, staggering human in the middle of a graveyard of ice. They raised their rifles, their mirrored visors cold and indifferent. "Target identified," a voice clicked over the speakers. "The human. Terminate." Kaelen didn't run. He didn't hide. He raised his stolen scroll carbine and aimed not at the soldiers, but at the base of the blue pylon. "For the hive," Kaelen said. He pulled the trigger. The plasma bolt hit the pylon's containment ring. For a heartbeat, there was a terrible, absolute silence. Then, the universe decided to get very, very heavy. The gravity snap hit like a physical hammer. It wasn't just a weight. It was as if the hand of a god had reached down and slammed everything into the bedrock. The peacekeepers, designed for the light, graceful environments of the Hexad, were obliterated. Their white armor buckled and shattered under the sudden crushing force. Their lungs collapsed, their delicate bones snapping like dry twigs. They were pinned to the ramp, unable to breathe, unable to move. Kaelen felt his own body betraying him. His knees hit the stone with a sound that made him sick. He felt his ribs groaning, his heart struggling to push blood against a weight that felt like a mountain. His vision went red. A vein in his eye popped, covering half his sight in a crimson haze. But he didn't black out. Earth had prepared him for this. Millions of years of surviving the Class 12 hellscape had given him a frame of iron and a spirit of jagged glass. He was a Deathworlder, and he was not done. The snap lasted only 3 seconds before the pylon burned out and the gravity returned to 0. Kaelen lay on the stone, his breath coming in ragged, bloody gasps. He crawled forward, his fingers clawing at the ramp. He passed the broken, unconscious peacekeepers. He passed the barricades. He reached the doors of the command spire. They were locked. "Zenith!" Kaelen wheezed. "Doors!" There was no answer from the jar. The Oryx had used the last of his energy to bridge the gravity pylon. He was dark. Kaelen looked at the door. It was reinforced titanium alloy. "Fine," Kaelen growled, his voice a bloody rasp. "The old-fashioned way." He took his climbing rope and tied it to one of the fallen peacekeepers' heavy sled drones. He wrapped the other end around his waist. He braced his feet against the spire's wall. He wasn't using a key. He was using kinetic friction. He fired the drone's thrusters to full power. The rope snapped taut, digging into Kaelen's hips, threatening to pull him in half. He roared, his muscles bulging, his skin tearing under the pressure. He was a bridge of meat and bone between a machine and a fortress. With a scream of tearing metal, the spire doors were ripped from their hinges. Kaelen tumbled into the command center. It was a room of white light and soft music, smelling of lavender and expensive tea. High Proctor Veltrex stood at the central console, her crystalline body shimmering with a horrified pale light. "You," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You shouldn't be alive. The math said you would be the first to fall." Kaelen stood up. He was a mess of mud, blood, and burnt skin. He looked like a nightmare birthed from the dark side of a moon. He raised his hand, not with a gun, but with the datapad he'd taken from the scrawl. "Your math is garbage, Proctor," Kaelen said, his voice cold and hard as a winter night. "You forgot to account for the variable that doesn't care about the numbers." "And what variable is that?" Veltrex asked, her hand moving toward a hidden alarm. Kaelen stepped forward, his shadow falling over her pristine console. "The variable that decides to stay when everyone else leaves," Kaelen said. He slammed the datapad into the console, uploading the Obsidian Fang's encryption keys and the recording of the Clean Slate protocol directly to the Hexad's emergency broadcast channel. "You're finished, Veltrex. The whole galaxy is watching, and they're seeing exactly what you are." The Proctor's light faded. She looked at the screens, where her own face was now being broadcast alongside the images of the broken, frozen students in the dome. She slumped into her chair, her crystalline form looking small and fragile. "Why?" she whispered. "Why did you do it? You're a human. You could have taken the money. You could have gone home a hero. Why save them?" Kaelen looked out the spire's window, down at the valley where Crix, Tune, and the others were slowly starting to stir as the fresh air began to pump back into the dome. "Because they're my squad," Kaelen said. "And on my world, that's the only thing that matters." He turned and walked toward the door. He didn't look back at the Proctor. He didn't look at the screens. He walked down the ramp, his boots heavy on the stone, and headed back into the cold to find his friends. The battle was over. The Proctor was fallen. The assignment was complete. But as Kaelen reached the bottom of the ramp and saw Crix helping Chun to his feet, he realized that the real survival wasn't what he had done in the spire. It was what they were doing now. They were holding each other up. Kaelen stopped. He felt the weight of the last 72 hours finally crashing down on him. He felt the pain, the exhaustion, and the terrible, beautiful light of the truth. He wasn't a monster. He wasn't a hazard. He was a human. And he was home. The command spire felt like a hollow tooth in the jaw of a dying giant. Outside the reinforced windows, the biodome was no longer a theater of war. It was a crime scene bathed in the clinical, flickering light of emergency recovery drones. Thousands of tiny, buzzing machines descended like metallic locusts. their blue scanning beams cutting through the lingering haze of the soporific gas. Kaelen Vance did not watch the drones. He sat on the floor of the High Proctor's office, his back against the cold obsidian pedestal of the central console. The silence here was different now. It wasn't the silence of fear or the silence of the hunt. It was the heavy, ringing quiet that follows a massive explosion. The kind that leaves your ears humming and your soul feeling like it's been scrubbed raw with steel wool. Across the room, High Proctor Veltrix remained slumped in her chair. Her crystalline form, once a vibrant, shifting tapestry of regal purples and golds, had turned a dull, muddy gray. She looked less like a leader of the Hexad and more like a discarded geological sample. Every few seconds, the monitors surrounding her pulsed with the faces of the High Council, enormous, shimmering entities from the core worlds demanding explanations that she no longer had the energy to fabricate. The broadcast is at 98% saturation, a small, shaky voice whispered from Kaelen's pocket. Kaelen reached into the rucksack and pulled out the nutrient jar. The blue liquid inside was so thin it was almost transparent. The single neural node at its center pulsed with a rhythm so slow it felt like a funeral march. "You're still with me, Zenith," Kaelen said, his voice a dry, papery rasp. "I am a persistent variable," Zenith replied. The translation was glitching, echoing through the room's speakers. "The Council has frozen the Proctor's assets. The Obsidian Fang is being intercepted at the Sector 4 jump gate. The math, finally, balanced." Kaelen leaned his head back against the pedestal. "Yeah, great. Everyone's a winner." "You do not sound victorious, Kaelen." "I'm tired, Zenith. I'm just damn tired of being the guy who has to break things so they can be fixed." The doors to the spire hissed open. Kaelen didn't reach for his gun. He knew the weight of those footsteps. Crix entered first, his crystalline body scarred and chipped, followed by Chun and the other survivors. They didn't look like students anymore. They walked with the heavy, deliberate gait of veterans who had seen the gears of the universe and realized they were made of bone and grit. Chun ran to Kaelen, his feathers ruffled and stained with mud. He didn't chirp or flap. He simply sat down next to the human and leaned his small, warm head against Kaelen's blood-soaked shoulder. "The medical teams are at the ramp," Tijun said quietly. "They want to take us to the infirmary. They say we have environmental trauma." Siki, Kaelen let out a short, jagged laugh. "Environmental trauma? That's a fancy way of saying the world tried to eat us and we bit back." Crix stood over the Proctor, his amber light glowing with a cold, judgmental intensity. "She offered us safety," the Volthari said, his voice echoing in the plush office. "She told us the galaxy was a garden, and that we were the flowers. She lied. She made us flowers so she could sell us in a bouquet." He turned to Kaelen. "And you, human. We thought you were the storm. We thought you were the thing that would destroy the garden." "Maybe I am," Kaelen said, closing his eyes. "No," Crix said, and for the first time his voice held a note of genuine warmth. "A storm destroys without purpose. You are a wall. You are the thing that stands between the wind and the weak. I saw the gravity snap, Vance. I saw your body breaking to keep that pylon down. Why? You owe us nothing. We signed papers to banish you." Kaelen opened his eyes and looked at the jagged, broken students. He saw the way they were looking at him, not with the wide-eyed terror of orientation day, but with a profound, quiet respect. He saw the way they were holding on to each other, the Volthari supporting the avian, the luminettes drifting close to the oryx jar to provide warmth. Because being alone is easy, Kaelen said, the words feeling heavy in his throat. Anyone can survive alone if they're hard enough. But that's not living. That's just not dying. I spent 10 years being a Deathworlder. I spent 10 years being the toughest guy in the room because I didn't want to care about anyone. But you lot, you made me remember that a squad is more than a list of names on a roster. He reached out and placed a hand on the glass of Zenith's jar. I didn't save you because I'm a hero, Crix. I saved you because I was tired of being the only one left standing. The room remained silent for a long time. Outside, the first of the heavy transport ships touched down on the mountain's peak, their landing lights casting long white beams through the frost. The assignment was over. The proctor was led away in silence by a squad of High Council sentinels, beings of pure light who looked at Kaelen with a mixture of curiosity and profound unease. As the medics began to load the students onto stretchers, Kaelen refused the hover litter. He stood up on his own power, his legs screaming, his ribs grating together. He tucked Zenith's jar into the crook of his arm and began the long walk down the spire. He passed the broken white armor of the peacekeepers. He passed the shattered doors. He stepped out into the biodome, where the flash freeze was already being reversed. The ice was melting, turning into a gentle morning mist. The scent of damp earth, real, honest earth, rose to meet him. He looked at the 18 survivors. They were being treated with a reverence usually reserved for war heroes, but as Kaelen watched them, he realized the transformation wasn't just in how the galaxy saw them. It was in how they saw the galaxy. They weren't the fragile flowers of the Hexad anymore. They were something new, something forged in the friction of the Deathworlder's heart. Kaelen, Zenith whispered as they reached the transport ship. The math is different now. I have been calculating the probability of friendship. Kaelen smiled, a real, tired smile that reached his eyes. And? What's the percentage, Z? 100%, the Oryx replied, with a 0% margin of error. Kaelen stepped into the light of the transport, leaving the dark mountain behind. He was still a Deathworlder. He was still a man of iron and scars. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't walking toward the exit. He was walking toward the others. 6 months had passed since the Aethelgard incident, a duration of time that felt like a lifetime to some and a mere heartbeat to others. The station had been renamed the Convergence Hub, and the High Proctor's office had been converted into a public archive where the truth of the Clean Slate Protocol was displayed for all to see. Kaelen Vance stood on the observation deck of the hub, looking out at the swirling violet nebula of the Hexad core. He was 30 years old today, though his face, marked by a thin, silvery scar from the plasma burn, made him look like a man who had lived 100. He wore a simple instructor's uniform, not the heavy armored jacket of a scout, but the light, breathable fabric of a teacher. He wasn't teaching survival anymore. He was teaching cooperative ecology. A soft, rhythmic bubbling sound came from the pedestal beside him. A large, reinforced tank of nutrient-rich fluid sat there, and within it, a vibrant, deep blue oryx pulsed with health. Zenith had been regrown from his fragments, his body now larger and more complex than before, his internal nodes glowing with the steady light of a stable star. "The new initiates have arrived, Kaelen," Zenith said, his voice now clear and melodic, projected through a high-end vocal synthesizer. 24 students, 2 humans, 4 Vulthari, 6 Oryx, and a dozen others from the Rim. The diversity index is at an all-time high. Kaelen turned away from the window. "Are they scared?" "Terrified," Zenith replied. They have heard the stories of the Iron Teacher and the Liquid Ghost. They expect an ordeal of fire and gravity. Good, Kaelen said, picking up a small, weathered wooden box from the table. Fear is a good start. It means they're paying attention. He walked toward the lecture hall, his boots striking the floor with a confident, steady rhythm. As he entered, the chatter died down instantly. The new students, a colorful array of tentacles, carapaces, and energy mists, stiffened in their seats. They looked at Kaelen's scar. They looked at his heavy, calloused hands. Kaelen didn't go to the dais. He walked to the center of the room and placed the wooden box on the floor. He opened it, revealing 2 pieces of flint and a steel striker. "My name is Kaelen Vance," he said, his voice echoing with a natural, grounded authority. "And this is not a survival course. Survival is an instinct. A rat survives. A virus survives. What we are doing here is much harder. We are learning how to be a squad." He knelt down, the movement fluid and practiced. "Most of you come from worlds where life is easy. You've been told that strength is a threat, and that conflict is a failure. You've been taught to hide your sharp edges and blend into the light. But I'm here to tell you that the galaxy doesn't care about your light. It's dark, it's cold, and eventually it's going to try to break you." He struck the flint. A single, bright spark danced in the air. "When that happens, your fancy tech won't save you. Your family's credits won't save you. Only the person sitting next to you will save you. And they'll only do it if they know that you would do the same for them." He looked at a young Volthari student in the front row, whose facets were trembling with anxiety. Kaelen reached out and handed the student the flint. "Go on," Kaelen said gently. "Make a spark. It's okay to be afraid of the fire, but it's not okay to let the fire be the only thing in the room." The student took the flint, his stony fingers clumsy. He struck once, twice, 3 times. Finally, a spark caught. A tiny orange glow began to eat at the tinder. Kaelen stood up and walked to the back of the room, watching as the students gathered around the small flame. They weren't running away. They were leaning in. They were talking. They were becoming a hive. He stepped out onto the balcony, looking back at the journey that had brought him here. "I spent 30 years believing that my life was a solo flight through a storm. I thought that scars were trophies, and that the only true victory was being the last one to stop breathing. I treated my heart like a Class 12 Deathworld, a place where nothing soft could grow, and where every visitor was a potential intruder. I thought that by being hard, I was being safe. But standing here, watching a group of kids from across the stars learn how to hold a spark together, I realize how wrong I was. The real math of the universe isn't about endurance. It's about displacement. It's about how much of your own space you're willing to give up so that someone else has room to breathe. I learned that from a creature made of water and a bunch of kids made of glass. They showed me that the most dangerous thing about a human isn't our muscles or our bones. It's our capacity to carry a weight that isn't ours. Survival is just the prologue. The real story begins when you decide that me isn't enough, and we is the only way forward. I'm still a Deathworlder. I still have the grit and the iron. But I've learned that a shield is only useful if there's something precious behind it to protect. And for the first time in my life, I'm not just surviving. I'm home. I spent so long building walls around my soul to keep the world out, only to find that the walls were a prison I built for myself. I wonder, have you ever caught yourself pushing people away because you were afraid their softness would make you weak? What would happen if you stopped being a fortress and started being a bridge instead? Kaelen Vance turned back toward the flickering warmth of the classroom, a single blue light from a nutrient jar following him into the heart of the fire. He reached out and closed the door, leaving the cold silence of space behind.